Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the One in the Many video cast with Rob Guzman. I'm Rob Guzman. How you doing? I'm doing well. So, we had a pretty full week this week. We have a lot to cover. Before I get into all the details and all the arguments, I do want to give my viewers 2 quick announcements. First, yours truly will be performing in a one-on-one debate in the coming weeks on the Me Too movement, which is now celebrating its 1-year anniversary. The resolution is going to be something to the effect of the Me Too movement has been a positive impact on society, and I will be arguing the negative on that debate against another young lady who will be arguing the positive. So the time and place for that debate hasn't been settled yet, but it is being sponsored by meetup.com, so it will be shown on their website. It'll be on YouTube once it's up, and I'll be putting it on my blog as well. So if you're interested, check that out, and I'll announce when that's done. If you want to see what I have to say about the Me Too movement and how I analyze it, what I think about it, it'd be good. Especially if you think the Me Too movement's been good, and you can only imagine the only people who would speak out against it are these evil, women-hating misogynists. I'm not an evil, woman-hating misogynist. I think my view is pretty reasonable on it. And I think it would do good for people to hear the other side. So even if you think the Me Too movement has been bad, like I do, come and hear this young lady speak, listen to what she has to say, and it'll be a challenge for both of us, I'm sure. So I'm excited about that. I love debates. They're so fun. I'm a huge ham, as you could probably guess. The other thing is just a note on my style and sort of the way I do things in these videos. Remember, the name of the show is called The One in the Many. And, every week you're given a lot of headlines. There's a lot to decide what's essential, what's not essential. And it's on me to sort of figure that out. And I cover the stories that I think are important. So if I leave something out, a story that you think is particularly important, feel free to tweet to me, email me, let me know, hit me on Facebook, whatever means you think, leave a comment on the video, and I'm more than happy to consider doing that story next week. Some stories I delay because I think they're kind of in their infancy. Others I think are just more important and I run out of time, so consider that. And also, one other thing, when it comes to these particular stories, there's a lot to cover. I mean, there are a lot of details, there's a lot of facts. I try to essentialize it as best I can. So you can think of it as not only one in the many in terms of distilling the one headline that's important from the many headlines, but also within a single headline, what are the important essential facts? What are the things to take away? What are the essential points to be made? And that's what I try to do. So it's from one in the many in the sense of headlines, and it's also one in the many on the headline itself. So if you think I leave something out, or if I'm being unfair, or if I'm not being thorough enough, again, tweet to me, email me, leave a comment. I'm more than happy to address that if my viewers feel that's true. So I want to cover basically 3 stories this week. We're going to conclude the story on the Kavanaugh confirmation, which I think is now drawing to a close. Spoiler alert, he was confirmed, so there's that. The other 2 stories involve a law that was recently passed by California and signed into law there by Governor Jerry Brown, and a policy change at Amazon, who is now giving their employees $15 hourly minimum wage. So I want to cover all 3 of those things and try to do it in a pithy way. So why don't we get started? I think the first place to start, actually, is this California law. And I'll just briefly explain what it's about. So this law is called SB 826. It was signed into law last week by Governor Jerry Brown of California. And the law says that publicly traded companies that are headquartered in California are now required to have at least one female member on their board by the end of next year. It's something they have to do. If they fail to do this, they can be fined up to $100,000 for the first offense, and then every subsequent offense after that, $300,000 if you don't have at least one female on your company's board. By 2021, this law aims to have close to 50% women on every board for every publicly traded company in California. So if you have a board of 5 people, at least 2 must be women. If it's a board of 6 people, they want it to be at least 3 women, and so on. This is similar to some laws that you've seen in European countries like Germany. I believe it's 30% women. are mandated on every board, and I think maybe it's Finland and France is the other country, or maybe it's Norway and France, now I'm thinking about it. I think it's close to 40% have to be women. So this seems to be a trend, at least in some Western European countries, and it's a trend in California, which is sort of a bellwether for leftist, progressive policies in the United States. California and New York are sort of the epicenter for the left in America as far as policy goes. So if this gains traction, we may see this occur nationwide. So many people, naturally, will think this is a good thing. They'd say, well, who could oppose it? I mean, all you're asking is for fairness. You're asking for just one woman on a board. You know, how can you not find a qualified woman? I'm sure you can find somebody who's going to be a good fit. And isn't it unfair if women are underrepresented on boards? Shouldn't it be something that the government should try to correct? Well, I don't think it is. I think this is a negative law. I think it's a pretty bad development. I think it's actually, if you want to look at it technically speaking in an economic sense, this is actually a fascist policy because it's the government dictating to corporations how they should and shouldn't conduct their business. It's telling them how they should run their board, which is something that's something the company itself should be responsible for managing, not a role of the government. And I think that's the most important point to be made here. This isn't a violation of property rights. It's a violation of that company's owners and stockholders to vote on who should be on that board. It should be the best person for the job, and the gender shouldn't matter. Of course, I don't believe men and women are different intellectually. I think they have the same intellectual capacities. So I don't think, a priori, I wouldn't say that I think women are any worse on a board than men. But if the only people that company has on their board is men and it's working fine for them, why should you force them to have a woman? It's actually unfair to the people they've already hired that are men. Think about all the men that had to be fired to make room for the women that are going to be taking those jobs. Why does the government have any say in that? This is an arrangement that was conducted between the company and the person on the board. It's a private transaction. Why is the government now coming in with a gun and regulating this to the point where people's lives are going to be ruined? I don't think that it's proper. I think it's really bad from that perspective. Now, there's going to be people who disagree with me. Now, one common objection might be, well, Rob, aren't you being a little hasty here? Isn't it true that women have been discriminated against by men and they don't have as much representation on these boards? Is it only fair that women get put on these boards to make up for the discrepancy? I don't think so. I'm an individualist, not a collectivist. I don't think in terms of groups or genders or races or anything like that. I think in terms of individuals. I think all that exists at the end of the day are individual people. They trade with one another. They make deals. They basically get promoted or fired based on how good a job they do. And to basically mandate that some group quota has to be satisfied is to basically place the collective over the individual. It's to say that the collective matters more than the individuals. It's more real than the individuals. In philosophy, we call this doctrine collectivism. It's the idea that the group has more primacy, more reality than the individuals that comprise that group. To make this concrete, let's think about this just in terms of a particular situation. Let's suppose we're talking about affirmative action. Let's say we're talking about, which, this board law is an instance of affirmative action. Let's suppose you have 4 positions open for a job, positions 1 through 4, and let's say you've got 8 applicants, 4 men and 4 women. Just for the sake of the example, let's suppose they all go through the same interview process. Maybe they're given a test, maybe they're interviewed by some people who work at the company. The way I see it, if you can interview these 8 candidates and place them on a scale from 1 to 8, from the best person for the job to the worst person for the job, your best goal in mind as an employer should be to take the top 4. If you judge their test scores, their interview results, and you look at it as an individualist would, you would say, I want the 4 best applicants for the job. Now, let's say in my example that it happens to be the case that of the 4 at the top, 3 of them are men, 1 of them is a woman. In that situation, you're ruling in favor of the individuals. You're saying, I want the best individuals for the job, and I don't really care that much about the groups. All I care about is the best person for the job gets the job. Now, let's reverse it. Let's say instead of thinking about it from an individual perspective, I thought about it from a collectivist perspective. Now, instead of saying I want the best 4 people for the job, my first priority is I need to satisfy this constraint that we have 2 men and 2 women. So what's going to happen? Well, we have the first 4 people. 2 of them, let's say, are men. Let's say number 1 is a man, number 2 is the woman, and then there's number 3 and number 4 are both men. Well, we'll hire 1, and we'll hire 3. Those are our 2 men, and 4 is out of luck because those 2 men slots have been taken up already. We need another woman. So let's say the 5th person in line is another woman. We'll hire her. So now we've hired 1, 2, 3, and 5 instead of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So who loses? Well, 4 does. He is essentially sacrificed for the sake of the group, for the collective. He's penalized not for who he is, not for who he is as an individual, but for who he is as part of a demographic or a statistic. And the company is actually worse off for it because now they've essentially taken someone who is better qualified by their own standard, number 4, and replaced it with someone who is worse, number 5. Now, the logic of this argument doesn't change if in the top 4 you've got 3 women or 3 men or 2 men and 2 women. It doesn't matter. You should always go for the best person for the job and not try to satisfy some collective criteria. Because when you do that, you're sacrificing individuals, which is a big no-no if you're an individualist like me. Now, one other thing I want to say about this, and some people will make this argument, well, discrimination is something that we know is wrong, but there are people who hold the view, and until the view changes, we need laws like this to make it so that men and women can be made to be closer together, so that they can be brought more equal. Well, to this I would say, first of all, it's not important that men and women as aggregates are equal. I think, like I said, as long as every individual person has the freedom to pursue whatever opportunities they want and to pursue their own interests without fear or molestation from the government or from force, that's what you should be aiming for. But let's suppose you really did want to make it equal. Does this law achieve that? No way. All it does is drive misogyny and hatred for women deeper underground. Now you've got people who basically are going to satisfy the law at point of a fine. Instead of getting fined, they're going to pick whatever person they can to satisfy the criteria, and they'll move on. And then if you mandate that, half the board is women, what's going to happen is they're going to hire half the women, and maybe they'll pay them to, be quiet, or they'll disenfranchise them on the board. All it's going to do is basically make people do things to avoid a penalty. They're not learning anything new. You're not actually teaching them why their original attitude was wrong. This is why you cannot change people's opinions with force. You cannot hold a gun to someone's head and tell them to be rational. Okay? It's not possible to force a mind to be rational. All you can do, the only way to fight irrationality and ignorance is by rationality and better ideas. You have to teach people that men and women are intellectually equal. You have to show them evidence and show support for the better ideas if you want those ideas to prevail. Using a gun, using the power of the government is not going to help you one iota. And in fact, it will hurt you in the long run. Because now these people haven't been taught to think, how can you expect them to make any other decisions in their life? If they rely on the government to tell them who to put on their board, well, you can make that argument for just about anything else in society. If you don't leave people free to use their own judgment and learn about these things, you're not going to progress as a society. You're not going to progress as individuals. So I think across the board, this is a disaster. It's a bad law. And I understand there are people who are, have noble ideas about why this law is good, but I think they are ultimately mistaken in that view. So that's all I have to say about that. So I think this makes sense now to move on to the next topic. Actually, it's somewhat related. It's an economic topic, and boards and how you anti-discrimination in selecting your board is a economic and political issue, and that's the idea of this Amazon $15 minimum wage. So Amazon, very large company, has decided to pay all their workers a $15 minimum wage voluntarily. Now, I believe in private property. I'm an individualist. I think if Amazon, as a company, thinks it's in their interest to make a $15 floor on their salary and pay everyone at least that much or more, well, more power to them. Good for them. If they have the resources to do that, if they make that decision, That's their decision. It could be right, it could be wrong, but they live with the consequences of that decision, whether for better or for worse. There's probably going to be people who support them for that. Maybe they'll get more business from people who, want to spend their money to a virtuous company. This is kind of like a virtue signaling move, in my view. But it's more power to them. Where they go wrong is in a recent statement when they announced this, they've also said that they're going to add more money to their campaign to lobby for a $15 minimum wage at the federal level. So in other words, they're going to do it themselves voluntarily for their company, but then they're going to spend money and effort to actually get the government to mandate that everybody do this. And this is just crossing the threshold, and it gets back into this idea of why minimum wage is such a bad idea to begin with. So I think to understand my view on this, you have to understand why minimum wage is a bad thing. So let's talk about that a little bit. Minimum wage says that nobody can work for any job in this country unless the salary is at least $15 or higher. If somebody is paid less than $15, it is an illegal job, and that person can be held liable for paying the person too little. So what's wrong with that? Some people would say it prevents exploitation from big companies who can afford to pay more and don't. Others will say, well, what about people who can't afford a living wage? They've got families, they've got homes and cars and kids, they need to feed their families. What if they can't do it on a $10 wage? And $15 isn't even that much, but maybe it's enough to get them through the threshold. Maybe they will be off the poverty line, they won't have to go and get welfare if we mandate a $15 minimum wage. Well, the problem with a $15 minimum wage is that it's essentially an anti-reality viewpoint. You cannot legislate productivity. Remember before I said you can't use force to change somebody's mind, right? A mind can only be changed by evidence, facts, argument, reason. You can only give them better ideas to change their mind. In the same way, you cannot point a gun at a firm and say, pay this person $15 an hour and make it work economically. If a person's labor is worth less than $15 an hour, then employing that person for $15 or more loses you money as the employer. And it would be irrational for you to do it. You will not stay solvent as a company if you employ people whose labor is worth less than the salary you give them. So what does this mean? It means unemployment. Ultimately, it means anyone whose labor is worth less than $15 an hour can't get a job, or at least can't get a legal job. They're driven underground. They have to work in places that are not under scrutiny of the public. They're basically committing a felony by doing this. So what's the answer here? Why are you basically making it harder for them to get a job when they would have happily worked for $10 an hour or $12 an hour or even $8 an hour? All of that is more than $0 an hour, which is what they're working at now. So the employers aren't going to hire you unless you're $15 or your labor is worth $15 or more. Now, on top of that, this also makes it so that people who have less skills who are starting out, so for example, teenagers, people who are young, people in poor communities, this is a huge problem ultimately for the poor black community, because a lot of them, their labor isn't really worth $15 or more. It may be worth less. Think about it. If you're in high school and it's your first job, you basically are going to take anything as long as you can get your foot in the door, as long as you can have some money to pay for gas for your car, go to see your friends, the bowling alley, buy a soda every now and again. That was me when I was in high school. I worked as a cashier at a drugstore. I was making just over $8 an hour when I was in high school. It wasn't much, but it was something, and I learned a lot on the job. I learned how to come into work on time. I learned how to deal with customers. I learned how to stock supplies. Heck, I even worked the 24-hour photo booth. Those things where you'd bring in a roll of film, and then they would basically develop your film in 24 hours or less, and you could pick it up. I worked that. I learned how to change the reels. I learned how to crop and edit. I learned how to do all these things with the computer. That technology has now largely been superseded by smartphones. Everyone has a camera on their phone. But at the time, it was actually a really good gig. It was after school, 4 to 10, 4 to 9, depending on, the day of the week. And, it was enough for me to, have some spending money, be a little bit more financially independent from my parents. If I wanted to buy lunch and have a fancier meal with friends, if I wanted to buy a cookie instead of, just getting whatever lunch they had, or if after school I wanted to go to the bowling alley or the movie theater, I wouldn't have to ask and beg my parents for money. I was independent. And I think, in a way, those early jobs, really do set the tone for people later in life. And to think about it, if you don't go to college, being a manager at a McDonald's or a gas station or a store, a drugstore, that's a pretty good gig for someone who doesn't have a college degree. They can make some decent money. They don't have the debt that someone who's coming out of college has. And, there are people who even start their own franchises, their own businesses down the road because they have all this experience. They know how to manage money. They know how to manage customers. They know how to manage a large staff. These are all positive things. And when you make a minimum wage of $15 or more, what you're doing is you're denying anyone who has a worth less than that those opportunities. And why? It's allegedly to avoid exploitation. Well, I got to tell you something. This is a really, really well-kept secret. Don't tell anyone, but there's no such thing as exploitation in the free market. It doesn't exist. Exploitation is a Marxist myth. In a free economy, where people are trading with one another voluntarily, if the government outlaws force, if it outlaws fraud, if it outlaws me going to you and kidnapping you in the middle of the night and strapping you to a coal mine with some chains and then forcing you to work, that's not an exploitive job. That's called slavery. That's called kidnapping. There are laws against that in a capitalist society. If you don't want to work for me, you're free to go. You're free to go and work somewhere else. And employers compete with one another, not just for customers, but for employees. That's proper. I mean, I work right now as a software engineer. I worked at a few companies. And whenever I was between jobs, it wasn't like I went with the first one that gave me an offer and I was exploited. It was a two-way trade. They wanted my labor. I wanted the paycheck. It was a mutual trade for a mutual gain. That's what happens in a capitalist enterprise or a free enterprise system. Exploitation doesn't occur. Now, I mentioned this briefly when I was doing my Nike video a few weeks ago with Colin Kaepernick and Nike and so-called sweatshops in the third world. By the way, this term sweatshop, I'm pretty much against the idea of a sweatshop because it's not really doing justice to what it really is, which is a facility in a third world country with no infrastructure, low skills, low education, for people to rise up and make something of themselves economically. There's nothing bad about that. There's nothing improper about that. If the choice is between working on a farm, starving, or working in a sweatshop, I would choose the sweatshop any day. And I think that's moral. I think it's proper. And I don't think that anyone in the first world who's sitting comfortably in a capitalist country or a basically capitalist country that has a great deal of wealth that was generated by the same sweatshop labor here in the West should be entitled to go to the third world and tell them that they should raise themselves from 0 to 100 overnight. It just doesn't happen. You have to build an infrastructure. You have to build skills. You have to plant roots before you can be a full-fledged oak. And that metaphor holds in this context as well with minimum wage. So Amazon, fine if you want to pay your workers $15 an hour, but don't go around and mandate that everyone do it. In fact, some people have pointed out that this is probably a political ploy by Amazon to bankrupt and force out their weaker competitors. Think about it. If you're Amazon, you're a juggernaut, you can maybe afford a $15 minimum wage for a time. I mean, I don't think even Amazon would be able to do it across the board. No, they're only doing it in the United States, and they're only doing it up to $15 an hour, which isn't that big of an increase, if you only consider U.S. workers. If you expand this to China, if you expand this to all the different employees they have all over the globe, that becomes expensive real quick. And so they probably are banking on the fact that there will be federal legislation eventually passed that makes it so all of them have a $15 wage. So they've gained some credibility with the left and a lot of these people who think that there is exploitation, and they've moved the needle on getting that legislation passed so that the weaker competitors they have, who don't have as much money as Amazon has, won't be able to afford it. They'll be hiring fewer workers, and they'll eventually go out of business. So they'll have to restrict their market share. They'll have to pull back from markets that have high labor costs. So I tend to view this as, a cynical political move, but it's buttressed ultimately by bad economics and even worse philosophy. So that's all I have to say on Amazon and minimum wage. So the last topic I want to cover is the end of this Kavanaugh confirmation. Now, this ordeal, this whole confirmation circus came to a dramatic end at the end of this last week. They have voted him in. They have sworn him in. It was a close 50-48 vote in the Senate. There were a couple of swing votes that changed their mind at the last minute. So, of course, Jeff Flake voted yes. He's the one who originally called for the FBI to prolong this another week and investigate. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska did not vote for Kavanaugh. She didn't vote against him either. She actually abstained her vote. She pulled it out last minute. A Democrat, Manchin of West Virginia, voted yes. And he did this largely because he's in a very competitive area where there are a lot of Republican competitors who are coming against him in the coming election season. And many of the polls show that West Virginia as a whole were very pro-Kavanaugh. So he voted yes. And I think the woman of the moment, the person who I think earns the most accolades on this, is Susan Collins of Maine, who voted yes and gave an incredible speech about it. She basically reviewed the whole litany of charges against Kavanaugh from A to Z. She went over all the flaws with his character. She went over all the flaws supposedly inherent in his judicial philosophy. She went over and she even talked about Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers. She talked about maintaining the innocent until proven guilty standard. She talked about not wanting to be intimidated. I mean, her office received nearly 3,000 coat hangers from leftist activists. Now, this is obviously a reference to coat hanger abortions, and it was essentially a reference to the fact that by voting for Kavanaugh, Collins was sanctioning the end of Roe v. Wade. She was one source, the Women's March organization on Twitter, even posted a huge tweet saying how she was a rape apologist for voting for Kavanaugh. But this is not even close to the truth on this. She came out, and I think she did the right thing, ultimately. She upheld the standard of innocent until proven guilty. She wasn't intimidated. And here's the real irony of this whole thing. You know, there are a lot of feminists who came out and were very anti-Susan Collins, saying how they were going to really work to get her thrown out of Congress now that she voted against them on this, saying she betrayed women, she's, a rape apologist, so on and so forth. Well, think about it. Here you have a woman, an individual, who's basically coming to a conclusion on her own judgment based on the evidence, people she's talked to, details she's read about his cases. She went very thoroughly through all of his cases and even explained in her speech, his ties to precedent and what he thought about things like Marbury versus Madison and Brown versus Board of Education and Plessy versus Ferguson. All these landmark Supreme Court cases. She did her homework. She did her homework on all of his jurisprudence, and she came to a conclusion that was different from them. And here we have a bunch of feminists saying, throw her out. I mean, isn't this the kind of woman that any feminist should be celebrating? A woman who basically came to her own conclusion and was strong in the face of protesters, intimidation. I mean, the fact that she didn't buckle under this call to be a gender tribalist is somehow a bad thing. I think that it's complete hypocrisy, and I think it really shows you that feminism today isn't about women. I mean, if it was, then feminists would, heap praise on Ayn Rand. What about someone like Ann Coulter or Sarah Palin? Look at what they do to these people in public, whether they're libertarian women, conservative women. If they don't toe the party line and agree with the feminist tribe on a particular issue, well, they don't count as real women, I guess. So it just kind of shows you the real mentality of the left. And this is really what I want to talk about on this point. I think this should be taken as a bit of a post-mortem on this whole Kavanaugh confirmation circus, because I think it really shows you a couple things. So for one thing, I predict, and I'm not the only one who feels this way, but I think that this is true, these midterm elections are going to be fierce, it's going to be ugly, it's going to get uglier. This is just the beginning. I've seen polls that say in July, something like 67, 68% of likely Republican voters said they were likely to vote in the midterm elections. That number, from a more recent poll at the end of October, or at the end of September, jumped to something like 82%. We're talking about a really galvanized Republican right wing, and the left has also been galvanized into action. There's a so-called blue wave that's supposedly on the way. But I'm looking at the polls now, and it was believed the Democrats were going to be winning by 14-point margins, and now it shows a 7-point margin. So I'm anticipating high turnouts in midterm elections. I'm anticipating really high-profile races being televised, lots of national reaction, and I think that even though I'm clearly a little bit more on the right than I am on the left, I'm not a conservative. I don't consider myself really a Republican, even though these days, I'm embarrassed to even say I would even call myself a Democrat. It would never happen just based on what they are now. But I think this has really shown me, at least, this whole incident showed me the real ugliness and nastiness of the left. And I really want to talk about that right now and just give you some concrete examples. So for one thing, we've seen last week at the hearings, at the confirmation itself, so at the vote on Saturday, there were over 1,000 protesters at the National Mall with signs and raging up against the senators, basically harassing them as they were coming in to vote, trying to cross police lines. I think they arrested something like 169 protesters on Saturday alone. And even while Kavanaugh was being sworn in after the vote, people were crossing police barriers and trying to get into the Supreme Court chamber, yelling and screaming to get in and actually heckle this small swearing-in ceremony. You had a Georgetown University professor put this long tweet last week, and on her blog showed this whole thing about how all the Republican male senators who oversaw this process should be killed, their bodies should be castrated and fed to swine. She said this. A Georgetown University professor came out and publicly said something this disgusting and nasty. In addition to that, you had doxing. You had a Democratic intern who doxed Lindsey Graham, Mike Lee, Orrin Hatch, and, basically leaking their private information, like where they live, online, on Wikipedia and on Twitter and other places, so that people could go and actually harass them at home. I got even more for you. Ted Cruz and his wife were harassed at a restaurant a few weeks ago over this. Basically, trying to enjoy a dinner between the two of them. And what happens? A whole cavalcade, over a dozen leftist protesters come in, surround their table, start screaming at them, won't let them leave, won't let them get up. The restaurant is telling them to get out. I'm told that the restaurant, or I read that the restaurant owners have gotten death threats for housing Cruz and his wife for dinner. This is completely hysterical. This is something out of Weimar Germany. And here's another example. Cory Gardner, Republican senator from Colorado, his wife got a text of a beheading after he voted to confirm Kavanaugh. He shared this with the media. This is unbelievable stuff. And, you even got places like Facebook, which is, of course, a complete leftist echo chamber, despite their attempts to be to sort of do damage control and hire more conservatives and all that. There was an executive, a Facebook executive, by the name of Joel Kaplan, who's a conservative, and he actually is 20-year-long best friends with Judge Kavanaugh. And he went to Kavanaugh's hearings. He sat behind him and he listened to the whole hearing, that emotional testimony that Kavanaugh was giving and Ford were giving. He was there. He was caught on tape, sitting in the front, and he was proud to be there for his friend. And what happens? Facebook employees, leftists, complaining, screaming, hollering, and making all these protests on their internal chat about how this is a betrayal of their culture and it's a slap in the face of their values. And you've got people like Sheryl Sandberg saying, you shouldn't have gone out there. It's his decision, but I wouldn't have gone out there given the culture of our company. The culture of your company, what does believing somebody with no evidence and standing by someone you think was wrongfully accused have to do with the culture of your company? Unless your company is a political shill, unless it's something that's not objective, unless it's tribal, unless it's based on believing women, no matter who they are, as long as it advances your political agenda. This is ugly stuff. It's going to get uglier. The Democrats are literally trying to out-Weimar Weimar Germany. I mean, they are like this close to having their own paramilitary organizations going around the country. I mean, if there's anything like that, isn't Antifa kind of like that? You know, these hooded, you know, black ski mask wearing people who go with mace and baseball bats at speaker events and try to derail it. I mean, this is really disgusting. It's really atrocious. And I think that, you know, like I said, I am not a conservative, but I would be ashamed to call myself a Democrat today. I think that they have fully embraced identity politics to the point where somebody's going to get hurt. There was a poll that came out earlier this summer saying that 1/3 of likely voters believe that there will be a second civil war in this country in the next 5 years. 1/3 of likely voters. That's huge. And of those people who were polled, 59% believed that it would be the opponents of Donald Trump, the left, who would start this civil war because they would resort to violence when they didn't get their way politically. I mean, this is dangerous stuff. This has to be put down with the fiercest words. If there are decent people on the left, and I know there are, I know people who consider themselves on the left. I mean, look at this walk away movement. I mean, this is something the media has tried really hard to bury. I run a meetup group. You know, we have people who come to my meetup group every week and we discuss ideas. And I've had people, you know, people who disagree with me vehemently on many things. They would have disagreed with me on 75% of what I said in this video, and they're ashamed to call themselves Democrats because of what's going on. They have decided to walk away. And I think that, you know, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I'm hoping the better elements on the left do come out of this and reassert their control, but only time will tell. I think, you know, we'll have to keep an eye on the midterms. We'll have to keep an eye on, you know, what the arguments are. But, you know, this is something that really needs to be watched. And I think that it can't get further than this without, you know, somebody getting hurt. So I would say, I'm getting a little heated myself here. So I think at the end of the day, the important takeaway here is, you know, ideas speak stronger than fists. You know, they always have. You know, you can punch someone in the nose, you can kill them, you can lock them up. That's horrible. You'll stop that person, you know, from doing things. But their ideas will survive. Ideas, as they say, are bulletproof. And they are the real legacy of future political action. If you really want to change the culture, you should do what I'm doing right now. You should be speaking with people, debating with them, using your words. I mean, isn't this what we tell every 3-year-old in this country when they start shouting and throwing food and doing things? You know, use your words. So I implore everybody watching this, anyone you interact with, use your words, use reason, use logic, and don't join some tribal faction and think that going out and throwing your body into a throng of protesters, getting yourself arrested, making death threats, sending lurid beheadings to wives of senators, don't think that this is helping your cause. It actually undercuts you. It undercuts you to most people in this country who are, I think, in the middle. So, you know, don't do it. I hope I don't have to talk about this again. I hope it doesn't come out to be even worse than it is now. I hope, as Susan Collins said in her speech, we have reached rock bottom and we can only go up from here. But I am not that optimistic. I'm pretty optimistic generally, but not on that issue. So that's all I have to say for today. I hope you enjoyed this program. Check me out on Twitter. You can check me out on Patreon. You can check me out on my blog. Links will be given for all those things in the video description. And be on the lookout for my public debate on Me Too. So with that, have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.